So let's be a little more analytical and see how we got to where we're going and some of the reasons. Take the issue of water. You know, there's no issue which captured the imaginations of the first generation of Zionist leaders like the challenge of developing water resources. If you take a look at who was who in the political framework, with the top most 5 powerful people in Israel's history for the first 40 years had to include people like Ben Gurion, who everybody knows had an unnatural obsession with water, wrote wonderfully about it. But even somebody like Levi Eshkol, when he was still a Shkolnik, his first public position was director of Mekorot, Israel's water resources. And who replaced him was Pinchas Sapir, the all-powerful finance minister for many years. This was their first job. And when they finally came into power, they said, now we're really going to do everything we wanted to do. And it was almost like some sort of Shakespearean tragedy where they loved the resource to death. And they overpumped the aquifers along the coast and salinized them. Tel Aviv's wells already by the 50s were undrinkable. They created a national water carrier, which to a certain extent realized some of Herzl's vision. I'm very proud that this camera is being supported by Alt Neuland. I think there's, if anybody wants to read this book, I don't think it would be wrong. I don't think Herzl would mind me saying. It's a horrible novel and a phenomenal vision, okay? And, but in taking the very salty waters of the Kinneret and bringing them as far south as Mitzpeh Ramon, we have salinized our soils. And if you believe people like Dan Zaslavsky, who's not some kind of crazy tree hugger, but was a national water commissioner of Israel, a professor at the Technion, he believes that future generations will be paying billions of dollars in terms of reduced agricultural productivity because of the saltiness of the water. So I would argue that if there's one Zionist axiom out here, taking the water, I used to do sort of the so-called hydro-socialism. You take the water from the wealthy in the north and you bring it down to the south, and you subsidize farmers because water is the resource, and you have a supply-sided policy. I think a lot of those basic components of the Zionist water strategy no longer exist. In other words, in the last 10 years, the hydrological community, the government of Israel has woken up and realized that it cannot continue such an unsustainable practice. So we now have water pricing, which I think is more or less realistic pricing. In other words, farmers pay more or less what it costs. And that creates, eliminates the perverse incentives to waste water. We have a situation now where Israel's finally upgraded its wastewater standards, and if the government will only complete its vision of upgrading our sewage treatment plants, it might be that some of these biological contaminants I mentioned could be taken up. And we've finally, some 50 years after Ben Gurion wrote about it in the most passionate and compelling way, have finally made the transition to desalination. Last year was the first year ever in Israel's history where more water was pumped to the country from the center of the country than from the Galilee. I always have arguments with my Palestinian colleagues, explain to them that their insistence on getting water from the Jordan River is foolish because the Kinneret doesn't have what to give. We're having a twin crisis. I don't really want to talk about climate change and the problems of it, but we've seen about a 15% drop in the water contribution to the Kinneret in recent years. And the Kinneret can now maybe give 300 million cubic meters of water. It used to give 500, okay, a year. So we're seeing a shift in where water comes from. It comes from desalination plants. Israel's now over 300 million cubic meters. Just 300 billion liters of water every year is produced, and that's the cleanest water you'll ever drink, better than any bottled water you get here or in Israel. And the recycled sewage, which the Shavdan, the Tel Aviv sewage plant, is actually by far the best sewage treatment plant in the Middle East. So I think that in many ways we're set in place a much more sustainable water policy, and it shows that Zionism has always been a pragmatic, nimble way of looking at the world, and have always been managed to adapt to the new circumstances. And I'm hopeful that these kind of policies will continue so that our children can turn on the faucets and drink the water without thinking they're going to get sick, and that people will one day may be able to go into Israel's streams and rivers and swim, or canoe, or things they used to be able to do before we made a mess of things.